Welcome back to Snowman's Favorites, the series where we look at strong and effective builds that have become a staple in my own gameplay and ones that I've really enjoyed. Today we're looking at the weird niche build that is the Throwing Specialist. Although not a super common choice and sometimes overlooked, throwing weapons have enough damage to make this list and are a great way of dealing with those pesky humanoids. To start off with the build, it is a build we found in Season 2, but it's still very useful and a viable in Legendary difficulty. There's many pros to the build, but there are going to be a few cons that we'll have to go through. Initially, you will see that it does provide good and reliable damage. Throwing weapons have a very low starting damage, but it does ramp up once you start getting the right perks and when you start using them in the right situations. Luckily, throwing weapons have a very high base accuracy bonus to the weapon, which allows you to not need as many stats for this build. It's quite easy to build in most situations for most bros, as long as they have the right perks. The build is also very flexible. You're allowed to use any armor you want according to the perks the bro has. Also, you have many weapon types available to you. There are 4 different types of throwing weapons in the game, so you have different weapons to suit the needs of the bro at the time, though I'll be explaining which weapons are probably the better choice to take. Other thing is, you will be able to have your offhand free in most situations to allow you to use a shield or a net or even grenades if that's your playstyle. So this bro is very flexible in the utility it can also provide on the battlefield. The main selling point of this build is that it's very strong versus most humanoids, and humans being the most common enemy in the world of Battle Brothers, this is going to be helping you in a bunch of your fights. So very, very useful indeed. Now, unfortunately, we have some cons to the build, and the main one is that there is a lot of perk requirements. Now, luckily, it's not like a big con because the perks that you do need for a throwing build are usually pretty common, but you still need all to most of them for this build to work effectively. Now, javelins, axes, all sorts of throwing weapons, they're pretty hard to throw, and that means they're going to be having fatigue problems. So we will have to try and mitigate that with our perk and stat choices. Limited range is another problem with the throwing build. Most ranged builds in this game have the ability to shoot from a very decent distance out of harm's way. So throwing weapons having a range of 4 maximum, unless you're shooting downhill, is going to be problematic with your presence on the battlefield. You also have limited ammunition, which is another big problem. You will not be able to stay very late into combat with battles that go on for tens of turns with a build like this because you're just going to lose all of your ammunition. You just don't have very much staying power. Finally, you're not going to have very good damage against high armor and high HP enemies, which is quite a problem because that is usually what you'll find into late game is really big enemies are hard to take down without really big weapons. And a throwing weapon person will struggle to be very effective and very helpful in those situations. But those are not all situations, which means it doesn't discount this build completely. Moving on, we do have the main build of the event, which is DPS, the Ranged Duelist. Now, this is where you're going to try and maximize the most amount of damage out of a throwing build, and we'll show you how to do it. Initially, you'll want 3 major stats. You want to max out your ranged attack at least 80 plus. It's a low benchmark because you get your plus 20% accuracy with your minuses, of course, to your throwing weapons. So an early stage thrower will get some very nice numbers in close range compared to a lot of other ranged characters in the game. You want to max out your ranged defense as well. 40 is sort of the benchmark I would recommend. We didn't get that here on this bro, as you can see there, but you want at least 40 plus on a good bro. Last but not least, you want maximum fatigue. You want to get at least 70 usable fatigue-ish, so you don't have to keep recovering every other turn or whatnot, and so you can keep wandering the battlefield because you're going to have to be moving around a lot, unless you're landlocked in fights. Now, I still do have a few suggestions. You don't just need those 3 stats. You want to max out your range attack, range defense. Those are your 2 key ones. You want to have at least about a minimum of 60 HP. You're going to be sitting within polearm reach quite often of enemies, so they can throw weapons at you. You can be an target of ranged attacks pretty often, even with high range defense. You just don't want to stray something killing your bro. 60 HP is a good minimum in most Legends builds. And as usual, you just want to max your fatigue. Moving on to the more needy sides of the build is the perks. You're going to be wanting 7 to 8 perks. That's pretty demanding. But as I said before, they're pretty easy perks to find. At least 50+% of brothers will probably have these perks. Initially, you want to see see bags and belts. Now, although I said most are common, I think bags and belts might be one of the rarer perks on your list of what to find. And unfortunately, it's a non-negotiable. If you do want some staying power and your fights will last longer, 2 extra bag slots to carry 2 extra sets of weapons, which is 10 extra ammunition on average, which is 5 extra rounds of fighting. Damn, like, you cannot give it up. You do need ammunition, as it is such a limit in this build. Quick hands is just going to save you time and effort. You need it to switch between your throwing weapons. If you're wasting half of your turn just switching weapons just to throw 1 spear or whatever, it's not. You desperately need the quick hands. Rebound and perfect fit or recover. Now here is where it gets a little bit iffy. I usually recommend as your fatigue recovery, because I did say this build does have fatigue problems. I recommend recover, but if you don't have recover on a bro, you can still make it up with rebound and perfect fit together. You can't do a throwing build with just rebound, and you can't do it with just perfect fit, because it doesn't reduce the fatigue costs enough or give you enough fatigue regen to sort out your problems. You kind of need both of those to solve your fatigue problems, or just use recover because that's a little bit easier with a higher fatigue pool. Throwing mastery explains itself. That is just a great fatigue reduction and extra bonuses for your weapon and damage. Thrust master is the only perk on this list of main perks and kind of non-negotiables that I'd say is negotiable. Thrustmaster is a wonderful perk. It removes the hit chance of javelins only, so it means your javelins are accurate no matter what distance you throw them, but it only affects javelins, and if you use other throwing weapons, one of the other 3 options, it doesn't help those ones. I personally love using javelins, and it's my preferred go-to throwing weapon, so that's why I really love Thrustmaster and highly recommend to add it to a DPS build, but it is a negotiable in all regards there. Duelist is non-negotiable. That is where you get a nice bonus addition to your armor piercing damage, as long as you're not equipping anything in your offhand. Great addition. Close combat archer is where the damage soars. This is why we stack our range defense, because you get a percentage increase in damage depending on how close you are to your target. And within 2 tiles, if you have 40 range defense, that is a 40% damage increase to the person you're shooting within 2 tiles. And if you're doing armor damage, you're trying to get through the armor, whatever it is, that's going to hurt. That's pretty much the build there. It does leave a little bit of suggestions. You have some great choices here. Depending on how you want to build, you want to possibly increase your fatigue issues. Pathfinder is helpful to walk across the battlefield because you're going to be moving a lot. Perfect fit on top of recover just makes it even more sustainable, but you don't have to get it. But if you're in perfect fit and rebound, you do have to get it. Stats, you want to upgrade your stats. Sometimes low stats are iffy, and it doesn't hurt to go a little bit higher. Wind Reader and Gifted are great choices here. Wind Reader to pump up that ranged accuracy. Against higher enemies in the game, it never hurts to get more stats. Even though this is a low stat requirement build, it's nice to get a little bit extra, and Gifted is just gifted. It's great. Also, since you're hanging around near the front lines of combat, defensives do assist you as well. You can really be flexible with this. You can start becoming a bit more utilitarian. Whatever floats your boat, basically. Colossus to help you get some more health. Rotate to save some other brothers or to escape sticky situations. If you're hanging around the front, you can get out of there. You can put another tank in, rotate something up, maybe rotate a dog. Anticipation is just free defense. And then a nice defensive like Battleforged Nimble or Lithe could help you along your way as well. It's always open up to how you like defending your bro. And last but not least, extra damage. This build is based on damage. Try and maximize that where you can. Muscularity does actually affect throwing weapons. So if you have a very high health bro, getting permanent minimum and maximum damage bonus to a bro's weapons is just sweet. So I highly recommend that. Killing Frenzy, if you're getting a lot of killing blows, getting bonus 25% damage. And then Clarity to get more armor pierced by 10%, because that's currently what Legends has Clarity at. It has changed multiple times in the past. But at the moment, it is good for a duelist build. Moving on to the result of the build, this is what it will look like. You will have your 4 weapon choices. You have javelins, axes, bolas, and spears. Lots of choices here with different types of damage, not just cutting, not just piercing, and not just blunt. They've got all choices for whatever situation you want to be in. You will get 2 single target hits per turn because it's 4 action points. As you can see here, fatigue is an issue. Now, without perfect fit and only throwing mastery, you get from 15 down to 12 fatigue. With perfect fit, you can get it down to 10, and that's why rebound can work, because 10 times 2 is 20. Rebound gets you 20 fatigue a turn as long as you're maxed out. So you can stay fatigue neutral with a perfect fit rebound build, but then you can't move around as easily. So that's why I recommend recover instead. It is great damage versus humanoids, not so much much everywhere else. So you can see why high health and high armored enemies can be a problem. Damage values around about 30 to 45, even the throwing spears of 45 to 70. That's not really gonna rock anything that has like 500 health. It just really isn't. Or even like 1,000 health like a lindworm. So you're gonna struggle a little bit in those areas, but humans who have lower base health but a bit of armor, this is where it's gonna be nice. First on the list, you have javelins. They are very accurate, very good armor piercing. That is their selling point. And armor piercing is always best against people who have armor, like humanoids. Now, with Thrustmaster, you can see there, we have a 20% chance to hit with no tile drop off. There is no -10 per tile of distance like the other ones have. So if you want to have a little bit of ranged damage at a distance, if you have really bad accuracy and your bro is really low in stats, javelins will pick you up with this perk and can be very useful and is usually my go-to. I love the armor pierce. It can really chunk down some humans and give you some good accuracy through it regardless. Second option, which I sometimes take with my bros just for the cutting damage and because it's good against skeletons, is the axes. The axes selling point is they're better against armor, and sometimes you just need that boost to help out against skeletons, mummies, all sorts of things that can be pierce resistant, because javelins do piercing damage, axes do cutting, and cutting damage is more universal, and armor damage is just helpful against whittling down bigger opponents, and it's just more helpful against opponents with higher health, usually. Third on the list, we have bolas. Bolas are what you get from goblins. That's what they always throw at you, and it's really annoying, so you may as well pick up a few and throw them back. The bola selling point is that it has an extra ammo. It says 5 there, but it's actually 6. But it has a little bit lower damage. Now, if you put this into a calculator, bolas have less damage output than either javelins or axes, so having the extra ammunition, I guess would only be good if you're trying to like do overwhelm or something, but I just don't recommend bolas. I can't recommend them as a major source for a DPS build. And spears, oh, well, just yikes. I don't want to talk about spears, but I have to talk about spears. Throwing spears are cool, but they're just so not viable. Really not viable. They have higher damage, as you can see there, so inflicts 45 to 70. Now, being like double damage to any of the main sources that I've shown before, that sounds really good, but it only has 1 ammunition, and it's super expensive to buy, super expensive to refresh, and 1 ammunition versus 5 is just so bad. And the other problem is, by throwing at somebody who has a shield, the throwing spear has 100% accuracy, but will only hit the shield. Its main job is to break shields and not to do damage. So if you're trying to use the throwing spear as a damage dealer, it is going to really disappoint you. And it's going to really disappoint you in its ammunition capacity as well. So I cannot recommend the throwing spear for a DPS build at all. Overall though, the throwing specialist and its DPS build is very fun. It's got good damage, but try not to rely on this build as your main ranged damage. If you want to be sniping people, if you want to be dealing with enemy archers, if you want to be mowing them down before they get to your front line, this is not the ranged build for you. This is the ranged build to be going toe-to-toe, helping out your polearms, helping out your melee, burning through their tanks, burning through their front lines, and dealing with people close combat. This is a close combat ranger, which is an oxymoron. Use your bows, your slings, and your crossbows for ranged support, and use your throwers for melee support. Now that's the main build. We'll move on to a fun build. Now, I don't fully recommend the throwing tank build, but it has been a fun thing for me to do on stream and in some circumstances because it's just fun to play around with it and it's like slightly viable. So I'll put it here as an alternate build, just if you guys want to have fun with it. The throwing tank, it sounds weird, but it kind of works. It's based on 2 main stats, so it's kind of easy to do, but they're weird stats. You want ranged attack and you want melee defense to be maxed out as much as possible. It's kind of weird. You do want at least 80 ranged attack just to be somewhat viable for extra damage, because you still want your bro to do damage, but you don't need too much melee defense. 20 minimum is what I'd say, but really shoot for the moon. Please go higher than 20, because you're going to be trying to max it out with like a good shield, like a Cypher shield or a tower shield, something like that to really just keep your bro defensive on the front lines. I've got a lot of suggestions for this, mainly mainly you want to max out the range attack and melee defense. Those are your main ones. But you do want a minimum of 60 HP. I might even recommend going higher because you're going to be a tank. Maybe go 80. Just go higher. You want to stack this HP being close to the front lines. The goal of a throwing tank isn't to really be up there in the front line tanking. It's meant to be like a side or an off tank sort of thing to support with a bit of range damage. But if you do have your flanks being overrun, it can step up as a tank. So don't think this is like a legitimate tank build. This is a step up, fill in the role sort of tank build. And because of that, you still want a bit of resolve because you might have situations where you're going to start to get a little bit surrounded and you're going to get some morale checks. So 60 is the recommendation for most tanks. So try and get to that if possible. You want to have a decent amount of fatigue. You don't need too much. Now, hear me out. Because of our perk choices, you won't need too much fatigue for this, but a little bit of extra helps. Finally, it's weird, but you kind of need a little bit of melee attack. Most of my tank build suggestions really rely on the fact that a tank needs to keep the enemy in front of them, and the enemy can't just decide to walk past you for free. So you need to have a decent melee attack for opportunity attacks. And 50-ish, 60 sounds a lot better, but 50-ish as a benchmark can help you a lot. Moving on to the perk choices, this is where you're going to be a little bit flexible, but you kind of want a bit of defensives. You still need 6 to 7 main perks. The reason why the perks choices are high for both of these builds is you need a lot of combination perks to help out throwing because it has that limited ammo, and the fact that you need quick hands, all sorts of stuff like that just really drives the need for perks. Luckily, most of them are quite common, even for the throwing tank. You're going to want dags and belts, as stated before, yet the ammunition just keeps you in the battlefield. Quick hands, switching from ranged weapons, very helpful, and including that dagger you saw. Rebound and perfect fit or recover is your fatigue options. Now, here's where I flip it on the head. As the DPS build, recover keeps you a little bit less bogged down, whereas the throwing tank, you want rebound and perfect fit more so, because you'll get your attacks and your shield wall down to a fatigue neutral state. So you don't have to move around as much, and you can not have to worry about your fatigue. So I highly recommend those two perks over recover in this situation. You want throwing mastery for the obvious reasons of having reduced fatigue and extra damage. Shield expert, that's kind of an obvious one. If you're trying to be a tank, you want your shields to survive and give you bonus defense. And you want some sort of defensive. It's very flexible, this build. You can be a Battleforged, you can be a Nimble, you can be Lithe, as in this situation here. Whatever works for your bro, but we got Lithe in this situation here. Now, there are some suggestions to make your throwing tank slightly more useful. You want some more stats, so Gifted and Assured Conquest, so Gifted for extra stats. Assured Conquest allows you to have bonus accuracy and defense in very confident situations, which hopefully your bros will be in. You can also get some more defensives like Underdog and Colossus. I think that tanks really benefit from these, especially for the survivability and if they get surrounded, or just in general extra other defensives you may find along the way. Things like Steel Brow, things like 9 lives, whatever you really want. Like even Resilient can be good because it gives you some bonus extra hit points. You're trying to be on the defensive side. Try and remember that this build isn't really focusing on damage, even though you need a little bit of damage to stay relevant in a party sense. This build is mainly just filling the spot of, oh my goodness, my flanks aren't super defensive, so basically I want somebody who can do some damage but still kind of tank it out. Now, what this build looks like in practice is you're still going to get 2 single target hits per turn. You still have your 4 options with the javelins and the other weapons, but as usual, I still recommend javelins. I won't go through all the weapons again, I did already explain those. But we do now have the shield for emergency tanking, which is going to be the main source of this build's utility. Luckily, fatigue isn't a main issue. Because you're going to be having perfect fit and rebound, everything is under 20 or equal to 20 at this moment for fatigue, so you can just sit quietly on the flanks. As long as you're not moving around too much, you shouldn't ever really fatigue out, and you should stay neutral. So that is a great bonus because of the way we built this tank. You have okay damage output. As expected, this damage is not going to be as strong as the DPS build because we're not maximizing our damage, but it's still okay against humanoids and just in general situations. As you may have noticed earlier, is you will have a spare melee weapon in your back pocket to keep zone of control. Now that does limit your ammunition, but it does give you more staying power because melee weapons last a lot longer than ranged weapons. The main reason for this melee weapon is not to stay in the fight. It's because you want that zone of control. As a tank, you want people to stay next to you and so they can't walk past or through you. The thing about that is when you're holding a throwing weapon or a ranged weapon, you don't have zone of control. You've got no way of stopping people walking past you. So a throwing tank is kind of an oxymoron because the enemies will just not give a crap and walk around you. So that's why in those situations where you're having to hold off the flank. You need to quick hands to your melee weapon to hold off the enemies and to hold your position and get support from your other brothers to do more damage. Now, a dagger is probably not the best choice, but that's what we had for our bro in the build that we were doing. I'd probably recommend a spear for the extra accuracy to keep enemies at bay. This is a very funny experimental build. This build isn't meant to win any awards. It's there to fill a gap. It's not super staple, but it is very fun to use. And if you have the opportunity to play around with this build in your own runs, just have a go. See what happens. Enjoy it. But I really highly recommend the DPS version of the build, the previous one mentioned. If you can play around with a throwing duelist, you're going to have so much fun against humans. You're going to melt them. I find that the counter to most scary humanoids, like Chosen, like your nomads, like your knights, a throwing person will really ruin their day, and it may give you a bit of love for the throwing weapons a bit more. So sit back, relax, and enjoy these clips. Thrower. Wow, you hit a 24? Ah, Mr. Thrower. 95, supposedly. 95, supposedly. Supposedly. Overseer, which is good. Good kill on the wolf. He's almost invisible amongst the corpses. I didn't even notice him there for a second. I don't think you're going to run out of ranged weapons this fight, so might as well just throw them. It's not going to do any damage. You are so dead, buddy. You shouldn't have moved that close. Why do they do this? Who do we hit? The behemoth needs to start having 84 miss? Yep. Wow, we lose. Well, I hope you enjoyed the builds today. I hope you will be able to use the throwing specialist in your runs more so in the future. Play around with it when you get a throwing person that just doesn't have the right specialties for you, or they just don't have the right stats for you, and you want to jimmy them up into a throwing build instead. It's very useful, very easy to build, and very nice and effective against your humanoid enemies. So I hope you can enjoy ruining their day once again, and thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll catch you in the next one. See yous.